Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Just a quick housekeeping to keep yourself muted unless we're in a meeting format. So to keep yourself muted unless we're part of a discussion. And I'll kick it over to you, Steve.
Thank you. Well, welcome, everyone. I think it's first you need to congratulate yourselves for all of you owning the fact that we're part of the later career people and not trying to use denial to put ourselves in the early career or something like that. So bravo. This is a wonderful panel with four really smart, lovely people. So I will try to get out of the way as quickly as possible. Just to remind folks, each of the panelists is going to speak for about 5 minutes. We then open it up to a Q&A through the chat. Eventually we will then go to a breakout room. I can't help but say that when I think about what a lot of people have written over the years about parenting across the lifespan, that there really is an analogous experience to sort of training people over the course of their time in graduate school. You know, when babies and young people are in that stage of development, our work is really essential. And then as they get older, we may become more intermittently essential. And if we're lucky, by the time they're young adults, we stay relevant to their experience. And so you can make an argument that when graduate students are beginning, that they find us essential in the terms of creating a foundation of thinking and integrating it with clinical work. And then over time, hopefully they become more and more autonomous. And one of the questions for us for this particular panel is, how do we stay relevant in the training of young people in the field? And how do we continue to apply our levels of integration over a lifetime of being in the field and being able to present that to people who can really benefit from that? And we have four wonderful people who are going to speak to that. So we're going to start with Cheryl Rothery. So please, Cheryl, do your thing, and we look forward to it.
Okay, thank you, Steve, and good afternoon, almost afternoon to everyone. Thank you for coming. Actually, it is afternoon here. So I'm going to try to integrate talking about my own career trajectory and that of my students as well. I attended Rutgers PsyD program and received very broad-based training in psychodynamic CBT and systems theories and approaches to treatment. From there, I worked in a college counseling center where I was introduced to the relational cultural model of therapy, a psychodynamic model that really resonated for me because of its focus on culture and context. For the past 26 years, I've been on the faculty and in leadership at the Chestnut Hill College PsyD program in Philadelphia, and the program's theoretical orientation is also a blend of psychodynamic, relational, and child, couple, and family systems. I entered academia through a very clinical doorway as the director of clinical training, and I joined a program that allowed me to grow and expand into a more academic role. I feel that broad-based training that included psychodynamic education and training positioned me to become a competitive candidate for a multifaceted academic career, and I feel that is also doing that for my students. I'd like to share with you a few things that we do within the program that may foster students' interest in an academic career. Though our primary objective is to prepare students for clinical practice, our focus on broad-based training also extends to preparing students to be in the position to consider broader career opportunities within the field, such as teaching, supervision, and consultation, and for the purpose that we're here today, psychodynamic, psychoanalytic teaching. Foundational is the composition of our teaching and clinical faculty. Over half of the faculty in our master's and doctoral programs have had psychodynamic, psychoanalytic training, and they bring this expertise to their teaching, research, and supervision. Our curriculum provides both the historical overview and modern-day approaches to psychodynamic theory and practice, with particular attention to culture and context, which is a cornerstone of our program. The work of current day scholars, some of who are a part of this conference, is included in our syllabi and required reading. And I think that's what really brings psychodynamic theory and therapy to life for today's student. We introduce students to the broad range of psychodynamic approaches to treatment. And we also teach them other evidence-based approaches and how to incorporate them to enhance their work when indicated, because we don't take that defensive approach of one size fits all for every problem and for every person. Outside of the classroom, we help students identify clinical placements that offer psychodynamic training and supervision. And I must say, this has become increasingly challenging over time. We encourage students to join local, regional, and national psychology organizations and divisions, to include psychoanalytic and psychodynamic organizations, which offer many opportunities for students to seek out mentorship, additional training, and networking. And Philadelphia is pretty rich in this area. The opportunity to explore teaching is provided through our directed teaching program, wherein advanced students have the opportunity to teach in our master's program under the supervision and mentorship of a faculty member. I'm now thinking about using this training program as a golden opportunity to prepare students for teaching psychoanalytic and psychodynamic course content. We encourage our alums to come back as guest lecturers to supervise at their places of employment and to serve on dissertation committees. And over the years, we've hired several of our graduates to serve as adjuncts in our doctoral program or to become part of our faculty. And again, approximately half of them have taught or teach psychodynamic courses. They serve as excellent role models for both current students and alums who might be interested in considering opportunities or careers in academia. As a psychodynamic program, we have had to arm our students with the tools to address skepticism about their theoretical orientation, whether the source is an interviewer at a prospective field placement, internship, or job position, to include a faculty position. And we facilitate their ability to articulate the evidence base for psychodynamic approaches, the value of their broad-based training and skills, their critical thinking skills, which I think are very much enhanced by psychodynamic training, the ways in which their clinical training is a nice segue for teaching and supervision, their experience with research through dissertation and other means, and their ability to play well with others from different theoretical orientations. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Bhupen?
Great, thank you. Welcome, everyone. When I first started in the field, psychoanalytic thinking and practice, it was vibrant and alive. In fact, my introduction to Freud and psychoanalytic thinking occurred in a modern literature course I took as an undergraduate student, which is what actually sparked my interest in pursuing graduate study. So much has changed since the late 1980s and 1990s. Although interest in psychodynamic and psychoanalytic psychology within graduate schools has declined, I'm actually hopeful that the pendulum is beginning to shift. And what fuels this hope, for me at least, is the openness that I've recently been seeing some of my students showing in terms of embracing psychodynamic and psychoanalytic approaches, but in particular, their voiced desire to continue learning beyond the single course that we offer where I teach. In addition to adapting my teaching methods and communication strategies to be effective with the new learner, I found it essential to present more contemporary understanding of psychodynamic thinking that aligns with certain current social trends that resonate with the younger generation. And I see three forces in the current climate that supports a shift away from rigid, structured cognitive behavioral approaches and towards a more contextual psychodynamic view of client work and human functioning. First, there's a strong tendency to deconstruct hierarchical and top-down systems and forms of communication. And while students initially become welcome structure in their clinical experiences, I found that many of them quickly turn away from prescriptive approaches towards the end of that first practicum or externship training year. And so timing psychodynamic courses to align with this transition can help students become more receptive to the psychodynamic ideas and techniques that we offer, at least that I offer in the course that I teach, and they find that it's more meaningfully applied to the work that they're doing. I had recently done that, and I think that's one of the reasons that I've noticed a big shift in the last couple of years. Second, there's a current trend or movement to account for individual and cultural differences and to offer space for subjective experiences, exemplified in concepts like lived experiences or microaggressions. And this leans into psychodynamic psychology. I found it meaningful to introduce concepts and techniques that emphasize relational context, corrective emotional experiences, and culturally informed constructs such as ethnocultural transference and countertransference early in the curriculum rather than waiting until I get through the traditional historical and foundational material. Lastly, with the growing trends in our artificial intelligence and technology, manual-based and prescriptive approaches can be performed easily and efficiently by AI models in a way that will soon, if not already does, surpass the ability of current providers. Emphasizing to students the importance of being trained to work with and within relationships can provide a competitive advantage for their future practice, can capitalize on this trend. Moving forward, we have to be strategic in facilitating and how we enhance interest in psychodynamic psychology. And I believe establishing consensus and consistency among us academics on the most relevant concepts and aspects of theory for application is really important and crucial, because I think that's what our students are really looking for these days. We should also consider empirically demonstrating which of these concepts are likely to be accepted by current students and start with these areas rather than the way we might traditionally structure how we introduce the topics. What I found interesting is that students really are engaged in practice. And there's a book that recently came out by Hannah Levinson about deliberate practice, and it has exercises and breaks down psychodynamic theory and concepts into actual exercises that they can role play in the classroom. And I utilized it this spring for the first time, and it was the #1 thing that students found the most engaging and the most useful of anything in the course that I offered. And so I really think that we need to start with practice, and they learn the function and the utility through the exercises. And then we maybe introduce theory and constructs afterwards as a more advanced idea or sequence. We need to encourage efforts to expand our research to cover psychodynamic concepts in functional and foundational competency areas. This includes a common research literature base that extends into things like developmental psychology, ethics, assessment. It can't just be a single course. We must find ways to introduce a psychodynamic perspective at the undergraduate level. Developing a psychodynamically informed yet universally relevant introductory psychology textbook for undergraduate courses would be a significant step in that direction. And as senior folks, putting our wisdom and trying to do a big project like that could make a huge shift in students coming into our graduate training programs. And then we need to be able to make sure that students who enter our graduate training programs can understand and see a clear pathway into the profession. That means they need to see opportunities in internship at the internship level, postdoc level, and specialty practice. I had a student who came who's applying for internships asking me, and so we're working on a project to actually work with APEC to try to get a survey to find out what sites offer what degrees of experience in psychodynamic training. And so they have to see a pathway, and I think that's extremely important. To highlight another effort actually by a group led by Ted Ellenhorn, they're working on 4 key databases that collect empirical and theoretical primary source articles in psychodynamic psychology around the evidence-based and scientific research, multiculturalism and diversity, the scientific foundations, and then education and training, and to make that openly and readily available. We need to have a common base, I think, because I think there's a lot of pluralism to some degree, but when we're introducing to students, we have to have some consensus on what we think is important. So I think I'll stop there. I don't know how much time I went, but it feels like 5 minutes.
Yeah, you did good.
Okay.
All right, Nancy, please.
Okay, hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to see so many longtime friends and colleagues. We thought it would be interesting to come together on this panel and say a few things about our different journeys and how they connected with academia, and to involve people who had rather different roots. Bhupen talked about pathways. I thought I would talk a little bit about my own and what I've concluded from it. I was for 40 years a one-day-a-week visiting professor at Rutgers. I'm mainly a full-time therapist, and my principal passion is for clinical work. It was my students and my faculty colleagues who encouraged me to write, an activity that has brought me boundless rewards and opportunities. As I thought about what I have to offer at this conference, I think my main message involves the importance of encouragement to students to write, to find their own unique psychodynamic voice in clinical work, in speaking, in supervising, in consulting, but especially in writing. And perhaps now that includes blogging and podcasting and some ways of writing that I'm completely unfamiliar with. I'm particularly invested in urging my psychodynamic colleagues and students to write, as I've seen firsthand how much gravitas and respect come from having put one's thinking out there in the so-called marketplace of ideas. I have to say, it's really quintessentially American to use a commercial metaphor when talking about intellectual discourse, but this is the culture we live in. It's been striking to me that the things I used to say before I had written anything tended to get ignored or passed over because they were just one clinician's notions. But once I had published, the same ideas suddenly had weight and heft. And when you put something out there, you never know where it's going to land. As a young psychologist, I was lucky enough to be married to an academic whose professional activities I saw close up. Processes such as speaking at conferences, submitting papers, creating syllabi, and teaching college students were demystified for me by their everyday presence in my domestic life. And I was also lucky in that Stan Messer, who's going to speak next, for many years the chair of the faculty on which I had an adjunct position, was the rare academic boss who championed clinicians and believed that there are many more ways to have a scholarly impact than doing randomized controlled trials of short-term treatments of DSM disorders with outcomes measured in terms of self-report symptom reduction. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but that's a very limited kind of research. He was a partisan, and not just of conventional quantitative science, but of theoretical dissertations, theory development, in-depth case studies, qualitative research, and the development of programs for service, all of which could qualify you as doing a doctoral dissertation at Rutgers. Because of those fortunate accidents of my history, I didn't need much of the kind of mentoring that Leora and I became alarmed is disappearing from academic psychology. But I think my situation was unusual in the 1970s and is even more so today. We're here to find ways to pass on a precious collection of practical knowledge and demystifying the communication process, the non-jargony, getting it out there process is critical. The ultimate impetus to my own writing was my students. They urged me to write because they got sick of hearing me bitch that there should be a book connecting personality structure to clinical process. Stan began nagging me about writing such a book when I first started making noises about doing so. The turning point for me was when, in the middle of my endless procrastination, he beseeched me How about just one chapter? Even one chapter would be helpful to us teachers of psychotherapy. One chapter was a brilliant cognitive reframe. I had written a couple of clinical essays for journals, and one chapter was no more demanding than such an article. Once I accomplished that one chapter, each subsequent chapter got easier. When I signed a contract for the book that became Psychoanalytic Diagnosis, there was the fraught question of a title. I wanted something sexy and memorable, but I couldn't come up with anything. I even bribed my supervision groups to think of ideas. Finally, I told my editor that I might as well call it what it was, Psychoanalytic Diagnosis. You can't call anything psychoanalytic, she responded in alarm. A book with psychoanalytic in the title will never sell. And this was in 1993. But I stuck to my guns, insisted on calling it what it was, and the rest, as they say, is history. I think there's a lesson in this for our own impact today. We need to get psychoanalytic ideas out there with humility, but without apology. We have an extraordinary intellectual tradition, flawed, of course, but also worthy of pride. At this meeting, we'll be trying to find creative ways of influencing a climate and an environment that has become toxic to what we value, and to find ways to support our colleagues in navigating the waters that are considerably more turbulent than the ones I was awash in several decades ago. It's important that we not do what analysts have squandered their time on for several generations now and fight with each other. We are on the Titanic, and we need to cooperate and send up the flares and get the lifeboats out. Thank you.
I think that's a terrifying final metaphor, Nancy, but entirely accurate. I am going to go to get my life preserver right now. But I'm going to pass it on to Stan while I get that. Stan, your turn.
Nancy, thank you so much for your kind comments. I'm delighted to know that I was such an effective nag, and it resulted in 4 books on your part, all of them very well known and widely read. So I'm a retired faculty member from the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology, known as GAZAP, affectionately, at Rutgers University, where I served for 50 years. Now, in thinking about my career, I believe there were 4 main factors that were important in my establishing a career in psychodynamic psychology in an academic setting. First, conducting empirical research with students. Second, finding a way to relate to my behaviorally oriented colleagues. Third, fortunate circumstances that brought about the creation of a professional school of psychology at Rutgers. And fourth, my taking on administrative positions that allowed me to influence curriculum, namely to include psychodynamic approaches and in hiring faculty. So I'll flesh out these very briefly. First, empirical research. I started off doing research on cognitive style, publishing in standard empirically oriented journals. Now, these research publications were an important factor in my achieving tenure and being promoted to associate professor. Empirically oriented research has been and remains the coin of the realm in academic psychology, and is the major entree into full-time tenured positions in many places, and certainly in Rutgers, a research-oriented university. In this sense, my route was fairly traditional. Subsequently, as I became more involved in psychoanalytic psychology, I developed an interest in brief psychodynamic therapy and did research using single case empirical models, which also got published in fairly traditional empirically oriented journals in psychotherapy. Second, relating to colleagues who are not psychoanalytic and some of whom were hostile to it. Here the plot thickens. I was becoming more interested in psychoanalysis, and so I basically left Rutgers for 2 years to take a half-time fellowship program in psychoanalytic psychotherapy at Hillside Hospital on Long Island, and to work as a clinician the other half-time in its outpatient departments. Peter Nathan had just become director of our clinical PhD program and set about to make it primarily behaviourally oriented by hiring Cyril Franks, Arnold Lazarus, Terry Wilson, and others. These three colleagues were anti-psychoanalysis. As I began noticing the differences and similarities between my outlook and theirs, I was developing an interest in the emerging area of psychotherapy integration. So I wrote about it. At first, it was to show the differences in the visions of reality in psychoanalytic and behavior therapy, and the interventions that were typical at therapeutic choice points from each perspective. I think of the direction I took as turning a lemon into lemonade. It allowed me to engage in dialogue with my colleagues, especially Arnold, who is the most clinically oriented of the three. And we did debate-style dog and pony shows together for several years, including at conferences and in articles that we co-authored. Third, here is where the third factor, external circumstances, played an important role. A number of psychoanalysts from Northern Jersey had the idea that a professional school of psychology was needed to produce more practicing clinical psychologists than the small PhD programs were doing, including, by the way, the one we had at Rutgers. This is a story in itself, but the upshot was the establishment of a professional school at Rutgers. We set up a curriculum that allowed for a psychodynamic track alongside a cognitive behavioral one and a systems-oriented one. As Cheryl had mentioned, she went through the program when those three tracks were prominent. So the psychoanalytic outlook was preserved and flourished with part-time faculty, like my friend and colleague, Nancy McWilliams, and Karen Rigskeen, who I believe is among the participants here, who took a very big role in this and who took over the course I had taught in brief psychodynamic therapy. A final factor of fostering a psychodynamic outlook at Rutgers was my becoming chair of clinical psychology for 9 years and then dean for 15. It's important for psychodynamic faculty to take on these roles to help promote psychoanalytic thinking in academia, because it allows you to influence, as I said earlier, the hiring of faculty in particular. And I'm glad to say that my successors, first Francine Conway, whom you heard from earlier, and currently Arpana Inman, are continuing to foster the psychodynamic approach at GZAP at Rutgers.
Thank you, Stan. So, you know, it speaks wonderfully to the four of you that not only did you have so much to say, but that you did it exactly within the time frame. So I'm very impressed. Can make my job a lot easier.
You scared us into it, Steve.
I know.
but
I do. I'm such
I
a
knew you were
fierce
going to be
guy.
tough.
Exactly. Such a fierce guy. So we really open it up now to questions and answers. Although before we do, I'm wondering if the four of you have things that you might want to say to one another based on what you had to say. Here's my attempt, Paul Wachtel, at integration. So thoughts that the four of you might have, and if not, we can obviously open it up to everyone else. All right, I'll take that as we're waiting for the waiting for the groups. So you know, comments, questions, please, by all means. We are headed into breakouts. We can't just even talk as a group. Okay, well, in that case, I thought there was going to be a little bit of time for us to talk as a group before breakouts. So
No problem. I don't have to start breakouts until you tell me. So
yeah, there's a concept of power. I don't know what to do with it. Well, let's give it 5 minutes to see if there's a general question or comment, and then we can shift over.
Okay,
Joe,
good.
I have a
Hi,
question.
Joe.
comment.
Kirkland, please.
All right. First of all, I want to say thank you to all, but without being too prejudicial, some of your presenters don't look as if they qualify by age. I'm not going to argue the point, okay? I'm not going to be a stickler on that, just comment. I actually appreciated all that they had to say. And Bhupen, I want to ask you, what was the name of the book that you recommended for
Yeah, so Hannah Levinson just came out. It's part of an APA series actually now for there. It's called, or the theme is deliberate practice. And it's called Deliberate Practice in Psychodynamic, I think, Psychology or Therapy. I can send you that link though. And what's really great for students is that it's available through Psych Info, so they can actually download chapters for free. They don't have to pay for it because it's an APA series. So it's wonderful.
That is wonderful.
That's great.
I think-
Joe, I think you have a question. You're on mute.
Yeah, I know. Okay. I wanted to make a comment as I was listening to this. I'm a kind of a retired professor. I was a professor at Adelphi for over 40 years. So, but what the kind of discussion made me think about was a developmental course that I followed that I think a lot of psychoanalytic faculty people follow, is that when I was hired by Gordon Durner, the emphasis was on teaching and teaching practice. And, I had a lot of support in that. And it wasn't until time went on that I became interested in writing and publishing. And then subsequently, I've loved publishing and writing, and it's become an important part of my life. And I've published a bunch of books. And, but I think when I used to have this conversation with Jacques Barbara, he would say about psychoanalytically oriented people, they don't want to come to academia. And I think part of it is that there's an initial huge amount of pressure to publish, which for non-practitioners, non-clinicians, is a major part of their training. And I think as a developmental process, I think for clinicians, and particularly psychoanalytic clinicians, that there has to be some room and space for their own development as in academia. And I think that's something that as a group, we could start to think about trying to influence the systems of authority to understand better and not to kind of use the same model of instant publication for people who are psychoanalytically oriented.
I think that's a really good point, Joe.
I think I'm really responding to that because I felt I had to have 20 years of clinical experience before I could mouth off.
Well, to kind of incubate a lot of ideas.
Yeah.
My department at Rutgers was always very gracious and proud of my scholarship, but I would always tease them and say I could never possibly have written those books if I'd been on a tenure track line here, because I would have had to be chasing grants and doing research that really wasn't central to my main focus.
Right.
And there isn't, there isn't for most full-time faculty an easy route that's anything other than paying your dues with traditional quantitative research and publish or perish for a few years.
Well, I was fortunate that, at the time I was at Durner, that was not a traditional publish or perish place.
Right.
So
think-
one way of, it doesn't exactly solve the problem, but helps, is to have different kinds of faculty tracks. So Nancy is talking about a 1 day a week position, but we now have at Rutgers clinical faculty with full-time positions, or teaching faculty with full-time positions. Now, these are not tenure positions, because that involves exactly what Nancy was saying, namely, going through the hoops, which you have to do within a certain time period, or you're out. It's the up or out kind of thing. But that has, I think, helped to expand the kind of faculty positions that exist in programs, and I would like to see more of that happening elsewhere.
Look, I understand there are several people who have raised their hands, but we're being pushed to go to our breakout rooms. So I think you should go ahead and do that, Ingrid, if you want to give them some help about how to do that. We are back, and my understanding is that groups have different questions that they've would like to present to everyone and to the panel. So please go ahead. So one is, how do we practically implement teaching undergrads and grads in the field? What are some concrete things that we would like to suggest? No answer to that one?
I think Paul has his hand up.
Paul?
Alice, yeah.
Hey, Paul.
Well, one thing that had come up in my small group this morning that resonated for me was the importance of communicating psychoanalytic ideas in accessible language. That, the language we use can be so much a kind of an in-group language and can sound both intimidating and impenetrable to people outside of the psychoanalytic world. And that then keeps us sort of alien from them. And since they're now in most universities, the majority, it becomes easy for them to then exclude these alien ideas. So the recommendation that came out, one recommendation that came out of the session I was in this morning was to really work at communicating our ideas in accessible ways. And that's not the same as watering it down, but it really is clarifying it in some ways, even for ourselves.
So a question to add, someone said in the chat is, how do we help younger people in our field deal with the discouraging comments they get, excuse me, regarding publishing and the right to publish?
Can I just interrupt? Because it looks like Barry had his hand up, and I also wanted to say something about the first question before we move on to the
Sure.
second.
Of course, sure.
Barry, you were first.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thanks for jumping in there. I'd like to piggyback on what was just said. For undergraduates, there's a need to create pedagogical materials. Now, that's a textbook, but it's other materials, multimedia kinds of things that it works for an undergraduate that is like helping people have courses to teach undergraduates that are favorable to psychodynamic work. That's a lot of work. I mean, it's a lot to that, but essentially that's what I think would be helpful at an undergraduate level.
I think it would too, Barry, and it also fits very powerfully with the idea of how we can mentor and help concretely people of the next generation or two to be able to expand the field. Rebecca, you were gonna?
Yeah, so my question, the people in my small group heard me say this because I'm a little more cynical because I work in Nancy, I see you smiling, because I work in a public health setting, which Nancy knows, where we are teaching. I run the program for psychotherapy at the Cambridge Health Alliance, which is a psychodynamic psychotherapy program. But as many of you know, because it went around Division 39 listserv, we were frozen for a year. They gave it back to us. We're now a 1-year fellowship, not a 2-year fellowship. So we're still surviving, but we're getting squeezed. And so my question is, like, everything we're talking about makes so much sense, how to get ideas out there. but how do we influence? To me, this is about money. Like I'm speaking up, but I'm not making any progress. And how, when I look at, we have people coming out of our program who do go into academia, and they do get hired in psychodynamic psychotherapy professor tracks, but many of the job ads I see aren't looking for psychodynamic psychotherapists. They're looking for people who are teaching evidence-based. And even though we know evidence-based also means psychodynamic, that's not what those ads mean. So I'm trying to think about, is there any way that we can actually influence the people who are hiring? Like, it's great once you're hired, how can you disseminate your ideas? But how do we influence what's happening in terms of what programs are looking for? Because I know more people are coming to us with less experience in psychodynamic, and unless they get it, they don't even know it exists. So my question is a little more concrete, but.
I think actually Ted Ellenhorn has an answer to that. I'd like to hear him just say a few words about what he said in our private group about the political changes he's managed to make with other organizations that will give credibility to psychoanalytic training in academia.
One of the things, Nancy, one of the things I was speaking to in our group was about how it would be good to integrate the enthusiasm and participation of this group with some ongoing groups that have been working on creating shifts within APA and also within ABIP regarding the integration of psychodynamic and psychoanalytic psychology within psychology, not just psychoanalytic institutes. And so several things have occurred, and I can share these materials with people. The council, the psychoanalytic, well, now called the Psychoanalytic and Psychodynamic Psychology Specimen Council, created the taxonomy for education and training in psychodynamic and psychoanalytic psychology, which goes through all the stages of training of doctoral, internship, postdoc, post-licensure, and analytic institutes for all different levels of opportunity. In other words, different degrees of exposure to classwork, practicum work, so forth. And that structure, the taxonomy, can be used in dynamic programs for promoting the fact that they have psychodynamic and psychoanalytic coursework and specialty within the program, which builds structures for people to move through. The other thing that's happening right now is that COA is on the verge of being able to recognize postdocs such as Rebecca's for APA approval and for APIC listing, which has not happened before. There's never been psychodynamic psychoanalytic psychology APA approval for postdoc residencies. So we're in the comment stage right now for APA or for COA, but that's a done deal essentially for both the competencies and for the guidelines, in which case they'll be able to start recognizing those postdocs. And then, as folks probably know at this point, there's a specialty within APA now, fully recognized by CRISP, of psychodynamic and psychoanalytic psychology, which recognizes the training at the doctoral program level and internship, and not just psychoanalytic institutes, and the subspecialty in psychoanalysis, which recognizes institute training. So those are some structural changes that have occurred in the past few years within psychology that can make for kind of structures that people can move into that weren't present before and give legitimacy. Along with that, as was mentioned, I think Nancy mentioned earlier, we have 4 databases and Bupa mentioned, 4 databases that will be publicly available. Building on the research database is built off of other databases that were available, but it's fully annotated. And we're actually in the process now of having AI update the database and make it as clean as possible. We have an AI program that just got written for doing that. And then we have an education training database, which has all the doctoral programs, internships, and postdocs and analytic institutes and societies listed as well. So all that, and then we have there's more. So all that stuff will be available for everyone soon.
That's great stuff, Ted. So appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, add one thing. I think that as I was hearing Rebecca talk and Ted and so forth, I was thinking that something we need to begin doing for the future is to build people that can be decision makers, you know, and that's administrators. And how do you understand budgets? Where do you get that knowledge from? How do you make hiring decisions? I think, Stan was talking about how when you become a chair or dean, you're going to be hiring people. And so, you know, people that have the skills to be effective in those roles are going to be able to help us expand. And we just don't have those in training. And where do you get it? And so that could be something that we begin to think about, or sharing models that other people have done at conferences, not just, you know, on theory and technique and those kinds of things, but how did I build a system in this particular place that others might take from if they are working in administration. So I think that that's a really important thing that we can start to maybe add to what we do and how we think about things.
One comment I'd just like to get in, because it's something we talked about before the conference, but hasn't come up except in, I think, Cheryl's question in the chat, is some of us of a certain age are reasonably well endowed at this point financially, and so many things require money. And I think it would be good for this group to put a list together of funds that support psychoanalytically oriented research or psychoanalytically oriented scholarship. I know of some funds like the Marcia McCary Fund, the PDM gives grants for research, but I think we could put together a list and we would encourage our older colleagues to contribute to these funds so that, as I said in the small group, the drug companies aren't going to do it for us, and the ordinary academic channels aren't going to provide these kinds of supports for research, but we could do something about that.
Well, I have to jump in here and say that Nancy and I established the McWilliams-Messer Psychoanalytic Fund at Rutgers to support each year a student who is doing something significant in the psychodynamic area. So one created a manual brochure for our clinic to introduce people to psychoanalytic, psychodynamic therapy. Another did a dissertation applying psychoanalytic theory to treatment of OCD and so on. In other words, that's something you can do quite locally. It's not a huge amount of money, but we get wonderful letters from these students who have been given this fellowship, and it's very gratifying.
Yes, and similarly, Thomas Klee, who was in the program and retired for quite a few years, gave a $5,000 scholarship each year to a student who was interested in following that professional path of someone who wanted to do psychoanalytic work. And this money would support their attendance at conferences, research, et cetera, very similar to what Stan just described. So yeah, it was very, very helpful and really sent a clear message to our students about how we value this theoretical orientation.
That's a very optimistic way to end this very fruitful day. And I must admit, I had my doubts about spending a Sunday morning doing this, but it's both wonderful to see faces that I've known or heard about, and also just to see how alive and well we all are, and want to be able to see our field flourish since it was so good to us. So I think on that note, we have to go back to the exciting world of the plenary session.
Yes,
Steve, I'm
there's-
sorry. We actually have 10 more minutes.
Ah!
Apologies.
All right, never mind. All those good things I said, I take it back. And let's try to be as pessimistic as we can over the next 10 minutes.
You know, one thing maybe I can add is I think when we talk about mentoring younger folks, I would encourage some of us to think, or for us to promote, inviting people to come in and learn how to be, let's say, research and to publish. How do we encourage actively? Because I know when I was developing, I wanted to be able to go into academia, but how do I break in? And especially being of color, or not feeling like you fit in, it's an actual harder thing to break into. And that if we can be proactive in inviting people and mentoring them and teaching them how the system works, rather than, because it takes 2 to 3 years to start a whole research program. And again, you're not necessarily taught that unless you go to a PhD program that was research focused. And we know that isn't a place or a breeding ground for psychodynamic therapists. So that would be my, my call. Like, can we invite somebody that we see into the work that we do? We might not be thinking, but they're looking at, all of us in this room as having something that could be really meaningful for them. And we want to just be mindful and be active in offering it to them.
Nancy and Stan, when you were talking about funding and it made me think about how City College has been incredibly fortunate to have alumni contribute annually. And even the last 2 hires that we had, we actually made a deal with the administration where if we supplied the funds to alumni for the first 2 to 3 years that they were there, that the college would then continue to fund them going forward. And so we were able to hire 2 junior faculty, both of whom have a real psychoanalytic expertise. And it was because alumni paid for those lines. And that showed to the administration that the program was really committed to growth.
That's quite a commitment. That's very interesting to hear.
Yeah.
I mean, the amounts I'm talking about were modest, like $4,000 or $5,000 for a student. But to support a line that way and then to get agreement from the university to continue it is terrific.
Yeah, we have over 500 alumni who really take the program seriously and contribute just a very significant amount of money over the years.
That is impressive.
Other thoughts? Yes, James.
Yeah, I have this may be almost like an aside, but I feel like I think what we're seeing in academia is a reflection of sort of people are talking about things like markets and marketplaces and pragmatism, and there's a certain zeitgeist in that I feel like is being reflected in academia, and universities are beginning to think of themselves in more like corporations and businesses, which is disturbing, right, on one level. But I feel like that one thing that people in this kind of group can do is actually to change some of the public dialogue around, I feel like if you look at the vast majority of stuff that gets published about human life and human development, it feels to me like the triumph of the shallow. People write very, very little about anything with any kind of depth anymore. And I think we need to kind of think about the culture as a whole, because I think what we're feeling as people trying to teach, right, in universities or function in them, we're really responding to forces outside of the university, and we are not trying to shape them. One of the things I remembered, there was a big explosion of humanistic psychology in the 60s and 70s, and that was driven into the universities, but because the academics, the psychologists, the people who were publishing about it in driving a bus around the country, dropping acid, I mean, there was a way in which the therapy people and the clinical people and the theorists change popular culture. And I think there's so much wisdom in this room. I think people need to be finding other ways to express, not just within the academic circle, because that academia is someone's pushing the rudder in a totally different direction, in the wrong direction. And I think we know that. Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
A lot more than 2 cents. Thank you, James. Other thoughts? We have about 5 more minutes, I think.
I just wanted to support what James said. And one of the comments I was going to make was this, what our students are being taught to value, which is quick and easy, which is expediency over true quality of care, which is lack of acknowledgement of the depth and complexity of human beings and their suffering. and what that means in terms of the work that we do. And, at the end of the day, for me, managed care is what's driving all of this. Their devaluation of the work that we do, it trickles across so many different contexts, and it trickles down to our students in terms of what they feel they need to be taught to be successful. And in terms of how they are treated when they go out and they talk about the psychodynamic training that they have received. So James, I liked your comment about, instead of responding to the forces, how can we begin to shape the forces? Because responding to them has not been working as far as I'm concerned. It's like just beating your head against the wall, because the forces are strong and really creating a very different value system than the value system that was in place when many of us went to school and were trained.
I think Paul has raised his hand.
Yeah, Paul.
Can't hear you, Paul.
I was just thinking of the comments that were just made that I think are very accurate about the way the society as a whole, and certainly universities, have changed, and the degree to which universities operate like businesses these days, that we all know about. And that in some way, maybe one wedge, one place where we could sort of create alliances of sorts, is that the pressures to publish stuff that really may not even be a useful contribution, but is paying your dues kind of stuff, is not only experienced by psychodynamic therapists. I think there are a lot of the best of cognitive behavioral and other therapists who have more clinical issues, more clinical interests, more interests in the person rather than just the symptom and so on, that they're being squeezed out also by this same pressure. And maybe one step in creating some alliances, since those people, although they're being squeezed, they often still have more power in the university and in psychology departments than psychodynamic people have, to use that as a wedge to create alliances, to sort of not have it just be about psychoanalytic or psychodynamic thought, but about thought that represents the value of clinical work, the value of looking at people broadly and deeply. And I'm struck, for example, that Cyan, which is a group that many of us value, has represented more clearly recently that it's not just an exclusively psychodynamic group. It's a group that represents understanding people in depth. And maybe there are allies that we haven't noticed because we're each in our own silos. And that might be a step toward achieving the goal of this group, this conference, which is not just kvetching, though kvetching is called for and can feel good in the short run, but is really to sort of see, can we change things? And that may be one way of beginning to do that.
A very good note on which to end. Thank you all again. Molly, do I have the time right this time?
You do. Thank you, Steve.
All righty. Take care, everyone. Stay well.
Bye-bye.